This morning's gospel reading reminds me of one of my favorite TV shows, Downton Abbey. It's been a little while since it was first run on TV, though its story is getting a final installment in a movie that will come out in a couple of weeks. For those of you that might need a refresher course or didn't watch it in its first go, the story of Downton Abbey centers on this grand English estate in the early 20th century, a moment in history where everything seems to be changing, and in the midst of all of this change stands this beautiful estate manor. At Downton, there are strict rules on how things are to be done properly. Rules about what clothes to wear and when, how you're supposed to act, and a lot of rules about how you set a dining room table and where people are seated and how meals are served. A lot of the drama of the show and some of the greatest one-liners happen around this grand dining room table. The TV show had to have a full-time expert on staff to ensure that the actors didn't break protocol and that all of the pieces of dining accessories, plates and forks and spoons and crystal goblets were in the right place at the right time. The expert was able to give them this sort of guidance because all of these rules had been written down in manuals for these great houses, and from these manuals we were able to know how people were supposed to act if they were at a dinner at Downton Abbey. We also knew from these rules that the grand dining table wasn't just about eating fancy food, but was also about showing who was the guest of honor and who was in charge. So at Downton Abbey, in the TV show, Lord Grantham always sits in a prominent place, and different guests that are invited to dinner know how important they are by how close they are seated to him. Or if there's a particularly intriguing guest there, and someone that might be more entertaining than Lord Grantham, the guest of honor might be seated next to them. In the world of Downton Abbey, you can figure out the pecking order pretty quickly just by watching where people are sat at the table. In our gospel reading this morning, it seems that Jesus has walked into a Downton Abbey sort of place. We're used to hearing about Jesus eating with regular people, or even the wrong sorts of people. We hear about Jesus eating with sinners and tax collectors. But this morning, we hear a story about Jesus sharing a Sabbath meal with the leader of the Pharisees. This is not a casual meal where you might just share cups of wine and pass bread around the table. Instead, this is a place to see and be seen. And where you sit at this table really matters. And apparently the Pharisees didn't have little name cards like they did at Downton Abbey, and so people had to guess at where they were supposed to sit. The Pharisees are watching Jesus to see what he does, but at the same time, Jesus is watching all of them too. And he decides to give two parables. The first parable is for those people who are trying to figure out where to sit and how to sit in the best place. Jesus says to those folks, don't take the best seat because you might be asked to move because you may not be as important as you think you are. So take the lowest seat, and maybe you'll get lucky and be asked to move up. The second parable he tells is to the host of the dinner. When you throw a party next time, don't invite these people that are here, these wealthy, powerful people that can return the favor. Instead, the next time you throw a party, you need to go out and invite the powerless and the poor and the undesirable who could never repay you for your hospitality. Now, you might be like me and not host a lot of formal dinners. So you might be tempted to hear these parables and just sort of brush them to the side. But I think Jesus is telling us something important that we need to take notice of. First, Jesus is telling us about how we should throw dinner parties, what our hospitality should look like. These are instructions about how we should use our privilege and our power when we have it to welcome and invite people in to receive hospitality and to make sure that we that we use what we have in order to honor and lift others up, not push them down. And if we're the host, we should make sure that the hospitality that we offer isn't dependent on somebody's ability to return the favor. Now, Jesus never tells a parable that's only about just one thing, and so these parables aren't just about what you should do at the dinner table. They are also about the Lord's table that we come to this morning. When we gather around the altar, right, we shouldn't rush to try to get what might be the best place, though in the Episcopal Church I will note that the front pews apparently are not the place of honor. When we come to the altar, it's not about how we show off or show up or how important we are. We don't check people's sin scorecard before they ascend the steps and come to the altar rail. All of us, ordained and lay, old and young, men and women, lifetime members of the church or new visitors, come to communion to the Lord's table in the same way, humbly with our hands outstretched. Because the grace that we receive here at the Lord's table, we are absolutely incapable of paying for or paying back. These parables about dinner parties are about this mutual love that we hear about in our second reading, the letter to the Hebrews. In this letter, we hear that we should have mutual love with each other, and we should offer hospitality because in doing so, some have entertained angels. Now, Jesus' teaching actually goes a step further because he says hospitality isn't conditioned on anything, not even the possibility that you might end up with an angel at your dinner table. Welcome, mutual love, and hospitality should be offered the way that God offers it, unearned and freely given. It's this mutual love that Jesus is pointing to through his parables and that is spoken about in the letter to the Hebrews that draws us together as the community of the body of Christ around this table. When we come here, we come together to remember through our worship, through breaking of bread and drinking wine, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But our reading from Hebrews tells us that we're also called to do a different sort of remembering in this moment. That we remember not just Jesus, but when we come here to the Lord's table, we should also remember those who are suffering, who are in prison, who are tortured. Hebrews calls us to remember this not just intellectually. It's not that we should sit here this morning and think about, oh, there's some folks at the county jail right now that are probably not having a good day. Instead, the reading from Hebrews tells us that we should remember them as though we were in the jail cell with them. We should remember them the way God remembers us, and that God never leaves us alone and is always with us. When God remembers, we know that God acts. When we hear the story of the Exodus, God remembered the people of Israel, and so he acted to bring them out of slavery and deliver them to the promised land. When God remembered us, he became incarnate in Jesus Christ and died for us and was raised for us. So when we gather here, we people who have the privilege to be here this morning, to meet the risen Jesus at the Lord's table, we're given the challenge of how we remember those who are suffering and hurting in this world as though we were with them in this moment. How can we remember the victims and survivors and grieving families of those shot and killed in Minneapolis this week? How can we remember as though we were with them the men and women that are in our jails and prisons? How can we remember as though we were one of them, the immigrants fleeing violence and oppression? How do we remember those who go hungry and thirsty in the wealthiest nation in the world? How do we remember the ones that are ostracized, attacked, or killed because of their race or gender or nationality or sexual orientation? How do we remember all those in our society that we might feel better forgetting about? How do we remember them and then act to show them the hospitality, love, and grace of Jesus? I think a key to answering that question actually comes in the verses that the lectionary skipped over and left out from Hebrews, verses 9 through 14. There, the writer in Hebrews reminds us that Jesus' suffering on the cross to save us didn't happen in the finery or the temple or in the Holy of Holies. Instead, the suffering of Christ on the cross happened outside of the city gates. And then the writer goes on to challenge us that we need to go outside to where Jesus suffered and is suffering, outside of the doors of where we are comfortable, outside of our places of worship, so that we can bear what Christ endured. The same Jesus who yesterday ate with sinners and Pharisees and challenged us to throw better parties and to do better in our world is the same Jesus Christ today who challenges us to remember the people the world would prefer to forget. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and it is only through Christ that we can make a sacrifice to God of lips that confess his name. And it's only through Christ that we're able to do good and to share what we have with all those we meet. Amen.